Hey everyone, welcome back to Hitting Your Stride. Today I have with me a special guest, Kendra DeVos, who is a social worker and counselor. Kendra has her master's in social work and has been in practice for 12 years. 3 years ago, she started up her own practice in London, Ontario, and currently focuses on helping patients who experience mental health concerns such as anxiety, depression, and trauma. She truly loves what she does and says it's an honor to walk alongside so many courageous people in their healing journey. Welcome, Kendra.
Thank you so much, Tracey. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you here. This is going to
Yes.
be great input. I'm positive that so many people are going to benefit from this conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So before we get started, can you share with us and the listeners a little bit of your journey with horses?
Absolutely. Right. I think I was that classic, like little girl who was just like obsessed with horses from day one. And I convinced my parents to put me into lessons when I was about 12. So I did some Western lessons, like at a classic kids riding barn where there's like 10 kids in a lesson. And I loved it, just fell in love. They couldn't pull me out of the barn. And then I ended up getting back into it as an adult. And it is wild how quickly things escalated from, so I was at a hunter jumper barn, I'm at a hunter jumper barn, and it escalated from once a week lessons to a part lease to owning my own horse so quickly because the addiction is real. And I just loved it so much. It's been absolutely life-changing in the best way possible.
Nice.
So
Yes.
couldn't be
And
happier.
where are you now?
Which barn are we at?
No, like where are you now? You took some time off, right? And now you're back
Yes.
into horses?
Yes, back into them, right? That's the hunter jumper barn that I'm at now
Right.
as an adult. Yes.
Nice.
So that happened like 3 years ago. And within those 2 or 3 years, it escalated from the once a week lessons all the way
Right.
to having my own
Awesome.
girl now. So
Yes. And
yes,
I've met Gigi. She's quite cute.
she is. I might be biased, but absolutely, I think she's adorable.
Awesome. All right. So let's get into this because there is lots that we want to talk about. So we are well past the end of the 2021 show season and now heading into this space that unless you're heading into a winter show circuit in the warmer weather, the reality is that there are a few cold and snow-filled months ahead of us. Now, I'm sure horses and riders are using this time to rest, recover, and take stock on how this past season went and if it met their personal expectations. Not everybody knows how to self-assess or self-evaluate. What's the simplest way to introduce self-evaluation to someone who has never really considered this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think the first thing that I think of with that is making sure that when we're kind of like you said, looking back on that past show season, that we're being like fair and balanced and how we're looking at it, because we as humans tend to have a negativity bias, which is we tend to look at our mistakes or what we feel like we missed on. And I don't feel we do as well as we could of like really noticing the gains and the success from that show season, for example, right? So really kind of making sure that we have that balance of looking at what you want to improve on or what your next steps are that you're working towards in the winter, but also really recognizing that both you and your horse had some amazing achievements or moments of learning or whatever it was throughout that season. So I think that that's super important.
Yeah. And isn't it something like we touch on this a little later on, but talking about perspective,
Yes.
like understanding that if we reframe, like, do you do a lot of reframing with clients? Yeah.
Absolutely. So what I was thinking too is that this idea around like, so first step, I think, is being really aware of what the goal was in the previous show season to really understand where I met my goal, or maybe if I made certain steps towards a goal, and then kind of knowing what you want that goal to be moving forward into the future, and really like making sure that it's something that's not so hard that you're going to feel really defeated trying to achieve it, but also nothing that's so easy that you're not really pushing your progress forward. So I think it's like a self-awareness piece when you're saying like the reflection stuff of like really sitting back and kind of being able to have some self-awareness of where am I at, where's my horse at, what feels like a really good realistic goal for us to set that feels exciting, and something that I want to work on through the winter.
Okay.
Which kind of leads me to my second thought, which is the self-compassion side of that, which is, making sure that you're doing all of that with that lens of kindness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're often very hard on ourselves.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that the whole like level of expectation that we place on ourselves, but I mean, I think too, like, have you ever dealt with anybody when you talk about self-awareness?
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about this in some previous podcasts with like entrepreneurial people. There's not, I mean, there are self-aware people out there, and that's awesome. But on a day-to-day basis, so many people really aren't aware of how their thoughts control them, when really we should be in control of our thoughts. We have the ability
Yeah.
to direct. Is there anything that you can help
Yeah.
people sort of tune into that?
Absolutely. Actually, it's really funny. I was just thinking of this. It was a rule of thumb that I use is that if you won't say it out loud to like a friend or a colleague, if you wouldn't offer the feedback in the exact same way, then you probably shouldn't be saying it to yourself. Right. So I think we're really constructive and kind if we're talking to our friend who, here's a way that you could have improved that moment, instead of saying something really negative about ourselves, that we would say that was terrible or I was terrible. But if a friend, struggles with something, we would be really kind or empathetic. So my rule of thumb is that if you wouldn't say it out loud to one of your friends in their face, then you probably shouldn't say it to ourselves, because our internal voice is often much more harsh than what it should be.
Yeah. And a few moments ago, you mentioned the word feel twice. And through life coaching, we try to get people to really connect with the feeling of what they want, or the feeling of what they're working towards. So how do you use that kind of language for your patients?
Well, I feel like I talk a lot about, which sort of applies in this world, but I feel like I talk a lot about kind of leaning back into like our own value systems as a guide. So that's where I come up with the idea around, say, if my value system is being kind, then I need to make sure, like, check myself that if I'm not doing that to myself, but I'm doing my self-evaluation, that that's not okay. Right. Or if I have a value of, that I think it's important to work hard, and it's not just about outcomes, that I also value like the process that goes into something. Right. Then say that if I'm realizing I'm not practicing that there's pieces of, sometimes you need to really be able to ground yourself. That's where that self-awareness comes in. And this is stuff that is important to me as like bigger themes in my life. And then that's your anchor for how then you can kind of assess against something, if that makes sense. So it's not just about assessing against the goal, that it would be about, yes, I have a goal, but my path to get there also needs to line up with my values, if that makes sense.
That's amazing. And what more of of an example of a process is learning how to ride ride a horse, show a horse, do all that stuff. So I mean, that's perfect advice.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Break it down into those. Break it down into those little bits.
Exactly. Right. Because things are changing so often based on the day and how you're doing and how your horse is doing, that it's never going to go steps 1 through 3 perfectly when you're learning. That much I've learned. So
yes. And I know for me, I think probably in the past year, the biggest thing that I've been saying to myself is, Tracey, just be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself. Like in those moments where I'm putting pressure on myself to get so much done, just be like, whoa, just take a break.
Well, and especially with horses, what I feel like is that I know that they're reading my energy. And so they won't be able to tell the difference between me being frustrated with myself and that level of energy that I'm putting towards myself, that they just feel the negative energy. And so then when I think of that, it helps me ground again, because I don't ever want to pass that along as little as possible. Right. So being able to quickly kind of reframe myself, I kind of think of her experience sometimes as well, and not wanting to pass along like my own, bad day onto her, or my own self-judgment.
Exactly.
So
let's touch on a couple of things that are pretty prevalent. And I know that in preparing for this, you and I sort of did our own little research, our own little
Right.
questioning of horse people that we know. And so we are having this conversation based on the majority of the feedback that we got. So this is going to be great. And
Yes.
everybody wants to know, okay, is there a difference between feeling stressed and feeling anxious?
Right. Physiologically, like how your body responds to stress or anxiety is going to be like very, very similar, if not indistinguishable. But the way that I like to, it's basically the feeling of your body isn't sure if you have the resources to manage the situation at hand, is the way I describe stress or anxiety. Right.
Okay.
So either you can move forward with that belief and like find the resources to manage the situation, or not. But either way, that's our body's way of learning, is to give us the stress response, because it's like, I don't know. And then we keep going and we have a success, or we learn something new, or whatever it is. Right. So the analogy I always like to give is that stress or fear would be if there's an actual tiger in the room, that your body be responding with stress or fear because there is a threat, there is a tiger in this room. We're going to have that physiological response of, I need to get out of here. Right.
Right.
That anxiety would be the exact same physiological response, except there's no tiger, no physical threat in the room. So it doesn't mean that anxiety isn't real, but it just means that there isn't that physical threat present, if that makes sense, exactly in that moment. So maybe you're thinking about a time there was a tiger in the room, proverbially, or you're thinking about in the future if you're not going to be able to do something up to your expectations. So we get anxious thinking about the past or the future.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So then let's come up with a couple of examples. If it's understandable that you feel stress, and it's realistic that you might have those responses when you are packing your tack trunk, making sure that you don't leave anything at home, right? It's maybe a little, when you're driving, you're trailering your horse to the show, and when you get the horse off the trailer, like just all of those little things, because you're not sure what can happen, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So that's, but your body sees, like you see, your body feels what's going on. So then
absolutely.
What could you say would be an example of anxiety within the show world, or people with their horses?
Oh gosh, I feel like the list is endless.
Right.
I think it'd be all that. What I always think of anxiety is all the what if questions.
Okay.
And so and I think we'll talk a bit later about how to manage some of the stress stuff, but if you're in the moments, like as you're driving to the show and you're saying, oh my God, what if I forgot this item? What if this, those types of pieces. I feel like a lot of those thinking into the future type pieces would be the anxious piece. What about, going into the showing season? What if I don't place? What if I, don't reach my goals? That sort of thing. Right. Yeah. I always worry about forgetting courses, like, right.
Yes.
Forgetting the course once you're there, that sort of stuff. Right. So then you do the what if into the future. I feel like the stress would be, because both of these are functional emotions. I guess I should probably touch on that too. It's not like we want to manage them, but not get rid of them, if that makes sense. So feeling stress before a horse show is like adaptive, if that makes sense, because you are gearing up for like a competition or something that you don't do every day. And that's just accurate. It's just accurate. It is like stress is good or bad. Like stress is, it's stressful to win. It's stressful to get first place, and meaning that it's just because your body's gonna be like, oh my God. Right. So and same with anxiety, that there's a functionality to it, but it's only when we're talking about when it gets like too big and that you feel like you can't function. Right.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, this is a little side question. And do you think the word anxiety is misused or put in places that it becomes a word that everybody gets attached to in a way?
I feel like it's not necessarily overused, but almost feel like it gets a bad rap.
Okay.
Like, you know what I mean? Like the ideal place in our society is to be calm, cool, collected, and feel nothing but chill at a show, for example. When I think this is like maybe getting into another topic, but I think if we were more comfortable as a society to be more vulnerable, that more of us would be talking about the fact that I'm sure even the Olympians that we all watch and admire, have anxiety and nerves before a show, but that's just okay. And they still obviously perform very well while doing that. So I feel like it's not necessarily that it's like overused, but I think it just gets a bad rap, as in we should be calm in the face of things like competition.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So how can we recognize stress in ourselves, and what are some of the suggestions that you have to help people manage stress in the moment?
Well, it kind of links back to that self-awareness piece. I feel like I would love to have is our whole society being able to check in a little bit about like what our baseline is. So just knowing ourselves a little bit better, to know this is what I'm like when I do feel calm. This is what my body feels like. This is when I'm feeling sort of like at peace or rest. That's sort of like what our baseline would be. And then from that place, being able to notice, because then if we're constantly in a state of stress, it's going to be hard to notice until it feels like a crisis that anything's even bothering you.
Okay.
So I talk a lot about trying to help people kind of come back to like, what is your baseline? What can you think of it to the last time you felt, calm or at peace, whether it been years ago, or I often help people do sort of like mindfulness exercises of a moment that feels really peaceful for them, and kind of like conjure that up and then note it. So, the classic would be like at the beach, laying in the sand, and you kind of tell me everything you see, how you feel, how your body is feeling, can you, smell the salt in the ocean, like all of that. And then kind of drop a pin in, this is what that feels like. This is how my body feels when I'm calm, because we just created it. Right. And then you can start to notice, okay, this is when I notice my stress signs, because I'll notice what's different than this place. Does that make sense? So I feel like we miss that ingredient a lot. So first step, know what calm feels like. And then be able to compare to, okay, this is what the other thing. So common signs like not sleeping well, increase or decrease in your appetite, racing thoughts, memory going out the window, all those types of things. Difficulty focusing or needing to be perfect. So like over focusing.
Yeah. That's a whole perfectionism thing.
Oh yeah. Right. I know. I always feel very called out personally by these lists, because I'm like, oh God.
Oh
yeah. It's just very true.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's touch then on to the anxiety portion of it. And you did mention this a little bit earlier, but I really think it's important for the listeners to understand where we're going to go with this. Okay. So can you share with us what physiologically happens to the body when it's experiencing a bout of anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic concept of how it all works is that we have stress hormones. And again, like I was saying before, there's some functionalness to this. So back to the example of a tiger in the room, we do need to be stressed, and we do need to prepare our bodies to like take action in some shape or form. And so generally our stress hormones give us that fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, where it's preparing to deal with whatever the threat is that's happening for us. The interesting part is that all of this was kind of developed as like a literal survival skill. So I always kind of reference like back when we were cave people living in the wilderness, that these are the skill sets that kept us alive. And it's from the same part of our brain that these chemicals come from. So it does create an interesting dynamic, because how I'm going to talk about them affecting our bodies is all supporting you for like a physical threat, but it's not super helpful if you're trying to, enter the ring for a show, or you're trying to remember what you need to put in your tack box. So it's just interesting, because it is exactly genuine to how your body is going to respond, but it's often not helpful in the 21st century. So the basic idea is that your body gets flooded with this cortisol or adrenaline, and it's shutting down everything that isn't necessary for you to run, fight, hide, do what you have to do to survive. So that's why we often get stomach aches, because your digestive system shuts down. Why you might get cold, sweaty hands is because all the blood would be draining from your extremities, going to like your lungs, your heart, your major muscle groups. It's preparing to like make the run for your life. That's why our hearts race, our mouths go dry. Like all of those things are adrenaline and cortisol flooding through your system, being like, okay, we're ready. Right. So it's not all terrible. I mean, your eyesight gets heightened, you're kind of prepped and ready to go. So there is some sort of anticipation for something. You're kind of tuned into your outdoor environment. But overall, I find sometimes that it's something to calm in order to get back into your thinking brain so that you can, remember the course or remember your dressage test,
Yes.
or those types of things, right? So the physiological response is assuming that you don't need to critically think in that moment, that you just need to like react.
Okay.
And that's where I think it comes into play with things like riding, is that we need to be thinking and being in our brain and our body at the same time.
So how do we get our brain
Yes.
back into where it should be?
Yes, absolutely. Right. So then this idea is around, first, that's why I like to describe what the physiological response is so we can recognize it. And then the cues to help yourself calm down are so simple that sometimes I think it feels frustrating, because it's not often going to be about trying to like, yes, you'll remember your dressage test, don't worry. Like that's like a second stage for me. It's more of a starting just with that physiological response, right? So it sounds like such a cop out. I always say this to my clients. I know it feels like such a therapist response to say, take some slow, deep breaths, but it's true.
Okay.
Because anything that you're doing that's different than what your body needs to do to run away from the survival threat is going to tell your body that you're safe again, even though there was never this tiger, but it'll tell you you're safe again so that you can do the things like start thinking and processing and remembering things again. So slow, deep breaths in through your nose, out through your mouth 5 times. Sounds like, I roll my eyes almost, but it works because your body has to slowly calm down. Grounding exercises. So taking 30 seconds to name some things that you can see in your space, what you can hear, anything you can feel, like the temperature of the space. If you're sitting on something hard, if you can touch anything around you that is soft or anything, it doesn't matter, just like feeling something and touching it and saying, okay, like this is hard, this is soft, this is warm, whatever. Anything you can smell, anything you can taste, like all 5 senses to ground you in that moment. Anything like that, like a lot of stuff that grounds the physical body, and then you can do the self-talk of the like, you've got this, we'll remember the test, we've done it before, we'll do it again, that type of stuff. But first body, then your brain's back online.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
There was something I was going to say. What about for grounding exercises, depending on the time of year, getting bare feet on the ground?
I love that one. Yes.
Yeah. That's
absolutely.
one. Or even like jumping up and down in place. Yep. Okay.
Absolutely. So that's actually a really cool one. If you wanted to just, could be a nerd with you for a second with the physiological stuff, is that
be a nerd.
If you do, if you do, like you said, get your heart rate up just for like 15 seconds, like it's not a full workout. It mimics the fighting or the running that your body thinks you need to do. So by doing that, jumping up and down or do some jumping jacks or whatever it is, it allows your body to release that stress, because it's like, cool, we did our job. We did the running. Sweet. And then it'll go away.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So, I mean, having been in situations before where I'm stressed and you feel like, oh no, I can't go work out. I can't go for a walk or a run because I have to sit down and I've got to figure this out. My gosh. The best way to deal with that is to actually go. So that totally explains what you just said there, explains why you feel better after you get some physical activity when you're feeling stressed or anxious.
Yeah, wow. Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said, sometimes I get it. Like, I don't think to go do a workout when I'm stressed, but it's talking about literally do like 5 jumping jacks, or like you said, jump up and down or run up a flight of stairs. There's something to get your heart going that can take like a super short period of time.
Nice. All
right. Your body will thank you.
Good. All right. So let's break down, if we can, the differences between anxiety, excitement, and anticipation, because you've said that they're all very linked, right?
Absolutely. Right. And that's why I like to kind of use this as a good opportunity to reframe, because what we've been describing through this podcast has been, our physiological responses to our environment, essentially, right? And so those cues, I just like to point that out, because the cues for anxiety, excitement, and anticipation, I have trouble telling apart, because it more depends on how I feel. There's that word again, how I feel about what's coming. So if I am, if we're thinking, say the holidays are around right now. So if we're thinking, I think of the holidays and I know that that's a positive experience, then I would interpret my physiological response as excitement or anticipation. But if I'm anticipating it being stressful, then I would label that as same physiological response as anxiety. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah. Right. And so I like to use that as when we're talking about show season, for example, as a really good opportunity to check in with ourselves and maybe do a reframe that, yes, being anxious for a show or for training or just in life is so normal, but it's possible that some of that feeling is excitement or anticipation. So I'll often get that anxious feeling as I'm driving up to the barn. And when I was talking to some of my friends at the barn about this, someone said, oh my gosh, like I feel the same way. And at first I thought it was anxiety. And then I realized, I think I just get, as soon as I turn onto the road, the actual road the barn's on, I get these jitters and I'm like, no, I'm excited. Like I've almost arrived and I'm there. Right. And so I think being able to reframe that with some of that self-reflection can help, instead of just assuming I'm horribly anxious about this thing. And maybe a part of it is anxiety, part of it is excitement or anticipation, but that they can feel very similar. So kind of taking a second to reflect and pull that apart might be kind of pleasant.
Yeah. I mean, as a kid, when, thinking about this, I'd get anxious, what I think was anxious about a baseball game I had, or my riding lesson, or my skating, or whether it be like, a test I had that day that I know I studied my butt off for. And I'd go out and I'd say, Mom, my tummy doesn't feel well. And she'd like, honey, it's butterflies. You're just excited. I'd be like, oh, okay. And away I go. And I was fine. So yeah, I guess it's really, there's so many different aspects to it, like to recognize, to reframe it, then your self-talk, everything falls into place, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, and I like your example because depending on how your mom framed that for you, then you were like, oh, okay, as opposed to like, oh no, I must be overwhelmed about something. So that's just butterflies. You must be excited. And you're like, oh, okay, so that's what that feeling in my body means.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when it can be, there's multiple options. Again, going back to, we tend to have a negativity bias that we would assume the butterflies must mean something's, I'm not okay with something. But it can be more about that self-reflection, about just genuinely checking in with yourself. Maybe it could be, but it also could be that I'm very excited about something. So on that test, for example, you don't have to assume I must not have done well. Maybe you're actually kind of excited to get your mark back because you're pretty proud of yourself and you're anticipating, again, that's anticipatory thing, that you're probably going to get some positive feedback because I think I did really well. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do you think then, given that we are at the end of the show season, like I said, because I know with some of my coaching clients, a lot of their excitement, I'd say it's an anxiety for these people. It's just going to their lessons, like you said, and it's, and it must make some people think, okay, well, why do you do it?
Right.
why do you put yourself through this if you're feeling so uptight, or you start crying halfway through the lesson because you've just beating yourself up and you freeze? What can you say for people in that situation, right? Like, show season is like what, 5-6 months away. But in some cases they start building this up in their mind now with every lesson they're in.
Well, I guess I don't know. It's a hard question because I'm kind of thinking a lot of things. I feel like it could be like checking in on a lot of stuff, like not the sarcastic, why are we doing this to ourselves, but like asking like, why are we doing this? So like, what is, again, I'm such a big fan of always taking really complex things and just going right back internal and just saying like, wait, why am I doing this? And if your core reason for riding is how you feel about connecting in this beautiful way with an animal, if it's about challenging yourself to learn something new, like whatever everyone's individual goal is, that becomes that central piece that can ground you. And either you might be off track, like if you're crying in every lesson, like, maybe you need to look at You might talk previously about the goal setting, for example. Are you way out of that window for yourself of what feels comfortable in terms of your goals? If you're feeling genuinely you're out of your depths or your horse's depths, then you're going to have frustrating lessons all the time. So it's not about you. It might be about, okay, I need to like pivot on where I'm at in my lessons, or what am I expecting of myself in these lessons? And am I doing that negative voice we talked about before, where I'm expecting perfection? And as we well know, right, perfection moments I feel like there's always moments of perfection, but not full lessons.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you feel that way for every lesson, then yes,
Yeah.
like look at it and what you're doing, why you're doing it. And is
Yeah.
there's something different you can do for yourself, right? Because
Yeah. Or even like we talked about how you want to frame it, because I think if I looked at every single lesson, absolutely, I could find things that maybe you want to improve on or didn't love or were frustrated by. And in that exact same lesson, there'd be moments of either magic or just moments of calm or peace or whatever it is that I saw. So some days I'm going there and I just need to disconnect and connect with my horse. And then there might be days that I'm like challenging myself to learn a skill or something like that, right? So I think sometimes, again, for each lesson, also looking at like, what is your goal? So if and what do I need? Because I might just need a really easy ride. Like I just want to go on a hack or a trail or something, and that's what I need, right? Or it's a day where I'm really going to be setting a goal that feels realistic, and then maybe get grounding yourself in that.
well, in such a sport, well, in any sport, but when you're in a sport that's dealing with another entity that has a mind of their own,
Absolutely.
yeah, like there's a certain element of surprise in a lot of
Yeah.
moments, like what's
Yes.
my horse going to do? So actually that kind of leads into the next question.
Yes.
So a big thing, and understandably so, that shakes a rider's confidence is a fall from their horse. What
Yes.
suggestions can you give to riders based on your experience of dealing with traumatic situations that can
Right.
help them work through this and get their confidence back? This is a big one.
Absolutely. Right. Well, I feel like that can be, it really depends. Like, I feel like the easiest way to start with that is like talking about it rather than feeling like we just have to like, I'm fine, it's fine, everything's fine. I think there is some absolute truth to the adage of like, get back on the horse. Like, and I think there is again, going with all the anxiety stuff that we've talked about today, there is some kind of proof in the pudding of getting back on will show you right away that like you can be okay, safe, that sort of thing. But I also feel like that there is some validity, again, that leaning into the being vulnerable part, to recognize sometimes when we might be okay physically, but if we're feeling rattled, that like, that's also just okay. Right. And then to be able to just, I think, leave space for those emotions to exist is step one, right? So that we don't keep trying to keep them inside and just act as if everything's fine. I think that would be definitely my first step with that. Like talking about it. Right. And then, to be honest, it goes back to, I know this old adage of the like paying attention to how your body's feeling, right? And noticing if your body's having a traumatic response. So it changes the lens a little bit from stress or anxiety to, okay, now you're driving to the barn after your fall and you're like very nervous about getting on, or you're having dreams or nightmares about the thing that happened. But I think it just means that we need to talk it through. Of course, the therapist thinks that, talking it through and talking to, whether it be a therapist or your friends at the barn, I think there's a lot of stories and war stories that we can talk about of falling off. And my hope would be that we can have those, again, vulnerable conversations to talk about the fear about getting back on and normalizing that. And then the strategies would be very, very similar. I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about strategies for this, but the strategies would be very similar, which is the acknowledging how you're feeling, validating that to be true, and then step by step, right? So it doesn't mean hop back on, but just trusting, feeling your body. So if it means being back at the barn and then starting to feel safe, allowing to find that calm just there again on the drive with your horse, where it would depend on the scenario, but where the fear kicks in. Is it putting a foot in the stirrup? Is it getting them from the field? Like where, you know what I mean? Like where that hits, and then working from that place.
Gosh, there's so much going through my mind right now. Okay, so for the first one, the example of how do you eat an elephant? bit
Yes.
by bit, right? You can
Yes.
look at it
One
and
bite at a time.
it's so overwhelming. But the way you
Yeah.
describe that, it's like, okay, if you're feeling that way and your confidence has been shaken and you don't know where to start, just do it bit by bit.
Yes,
One,
absolutely.
like you said, the
Yeah.
drive to the barn, putting your foot in the stirrup. And you know what? I was also thinking too, like as a kid, riding, I took some pretty good tumbles, and the first thing everybody wants to come to you and say is, oh, you're fine, right?
Yeah.
Like they're trying to reassure you, and in that moment you're like, okay, yeah, I'm fine, and you haven't had a chance to process what's happened. And
Exactly.
right, and then you're like, okay, so yeah. And there's something, I mean, horse people, we are a special breed. We choose to get on this animal, so I mean, kudos to us for so much of that. But at the same point in time, I don't know if we give ourselves enough kindness to
Yes.
appreciate what we're doing. And then, like,
Absolutely.
the horses pick up on it, and then bingo, there's a
Yes.
recipe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. I think that it is, I get it. It's such a kind thing for us to say, you're fine, like you're fine. And that's great in that moment. And I think it would be lovely to have more conversations in the equestrian sports about like the checking in after, to be like, because again, going back to the physiological stuff, you're going to be, your whole body's going to be jacked up after a fall.
Wired. Yeah.
Because there was an actual threat there, right? And so your body will be jacked up, and so you're again in that survival state, and you're not going to feel the depth of the emotions or do the processing that you were just saying, Tracey, until your body has calmed down, and now you're in the tech room, maybe by yourself,
Mhm.
right? Maybe with other people, and you have to either pretend everything's fine, or I like to have a good cry after I've had a fall, right? And just be like, okay, that was scary. And you're technically okay physically, hopefully, right? Assuming that you're physically fine,
Yeah.
but it's still really scary. And so sometimes just, realizing that, like, yes, you're fine. And so I also love the both and conversations where you can be fine and not fine at the exact same time.
And that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think this sport, and I mean anything we do on a day to day, we don't have to get on horses to know that
No,
working around them and everything, there is a risk. We get that.
absolutely.
It,
Yeah.
so I think there's an element of courage that,
Yep. Oh,
we
beautiful. Yeah.
need to recognize that it takes courage to do what we do, and give ourselves a pat on the back and reaffirm that for ourselves. And then you mentioned the word vulnerability, which you and I have talked about, that both of us
Mhm.
quite love, because without
Yeah.
vulnerability you cannot grow, because it allows you to open up. And I have a quote here. It's if you don't ask for help, the right people can't come into your life. So
Yeah.
by asking for help, you're being vulnerable. By asking for some advice or for a sounding board, I mean, that's okay.
Yeah. I think even acknowledging when you're not okay is vulnerable. And that's a way of asking for help too. Right. So not just assuming that the only solution is to hop back on your horse, that the solution could be one of many things. And even say, for example, like riding someone else's horse, ride the trusty lesson horse who has seen it all. And then that might build your confidence back to kind of get used to you back in a saddle. And then I go on to my horse if that's, feels like too big of a step, but like acknowledging this is what I need in
Yeah.
order to feel better, could be really
Yeah.
transformative.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could talk about this forever. And
Absolutely. Vulnerability is my
and
favorite.
I don't know, we might as well share the exciting news that you're coming back in the spring.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Part 2 coming soon.
Yes, we're gonna have a few more things to talk about in the preparation idea of the show season. So let's move on then a little bit, because
Yeah.
along with the fact that I said earlier that snow-filled, quiet months with not doing a whole bunch, people spending a lot of time in the barn.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that I hear a lot about from both massage clients and coaching clients is how the social element of the barn can be a double-edged sword. For so
Absolutely.
many, the barn is a form of relaxation, and it provides its own therapy as you spend time with your horse. However, this comes into conflict when you encounter issues when dealing with social dynamics. How would you advise people to manage themselves first in these situations, like the following? So dealing with barn gossip, having toxic
Right.
people around, and handling people's opinions when they weren't asked for.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Right. And I feel like we have a really cool thread going through all of these, because I think, again, that first ingredient is sort of feeling confident or good about yourself and where you're at in your own riding journey, that we're not all going to be in the same place or have the same goals. And so, something to realize, I think that we are naturally like comparative. So if I'm at whatever place I'm in and maybe on my own, I feel good about where I'm at. If I look at someone else riding, before we even get into the toxic and the negative, like people making comments, just watching someone else who, is just having a beautiful ride can make us kind of do the negative stuff for ourselves, right? So I think first step is always kind of feeling really good about where you're at. And then again, that becomes the foundation of I am where I am, and I'm happy and proud, and I'm working towards things, and I'm proud of things, and everyone's going to be on a different journey. So I think that's like step one.
Okay.
And then, yes, like the barn gossip and the kind of negative attitudes or whatever, I feel like it's really going to be important to like know your boundaries, and just not, and this is something that's hard. Like I hate having to set boundaries, like, but it's something that I think is really important to know. And that uncomfortable feeling we get when people make comments, for example, isn't necessarily that they're right, or it's because I feel bad about what they said. But sometimes I think it's that we can feel that they've crossed a boundary. Like that wasn't an okay thing to say, but right. And so I think there's that sense around recognizing that a lot of that can be about the boundary crossing idea. So in terms of like what to do, I always think of this old adage of what is it, like people earn, I think this is one of my favorite social work people is Brene Brown. So she's also just she has lots of books out there, and she does a lot of good work around vulnerability, and she always talks about how people need to earn their spot in your life. And so I use that myself a lot as well. So if someone's being toxic or it has like a negative energy around the barn, that I kind of think back to be like, okay, like if this isn't someone that I would ask, like I respect them and I want their opinion and I ask them for feedback. If I'm not taking criticism from people that I wouldn't ask advice from.
Ooh, that's
right. Yeah. Right.
okay.
I feel like I read that somewhere. I didn't make that up, but that idea around don't take criticism from people you wouldn't ask advice from. And that's, to me, links the Brene Brown concept of people have to earn their spot in order for me to respect them enough to be wanting or asking for their opinion. And then if they haven't earned that spot, then I'm not going to accept criticism from them either.
Yeah. And I mean, and let's face it too. I mean, barns are like their own little communities.
Absolutely.
Right? So when you go to the barn, and it's great, we want that. I mean, I can walk into a barn and I'm like, whoa, like when I'm there to massage horses, and I'm like, this place feels good. There are other barns where I'm like, oh boy, there's a lot of tension in here. So I think, and here's a question. Do you think that because it's a community that certain people feel like they just have the right to say stuff to other people that these other people don't want to hear? And right.
I mean, the psychology of this again could be a whole hour as to like why people offer that type of advice, right? So sometimes if they genuinely feel they're being helpful, but it's mistimed, or if there is like you said, you can read the energy that there is this negative intent. I just feel like to be honest, like you said, you could spend an hour trying to figure it out. And the way I personally like to look at those scenarios, and what I share often with my clients, is that ultimately that the motivation doesn't matter if it's crossing your boundary. What we as the individual could focus on is if something crosses your boundary, whether they meant to be nice or they meant to be mean, that's almost irrelevant, because if you need to set a boundary, then you just need to set the boundary. Like if it made you uncomfortable, whether it was meant to make you uncomfortable or not, it just did. So then, right. So either you can choose on your own to not take that criticism or feedback and kind of manage that how you interpret it, or the everyone's favorite setting boundaries piece. And to be honest, that's where that both and thinking that we talked about just a second ago comes into play. So something like I appreciate your feedback and I'm happy with the way I've chosen to do this, or proceed with this or whatever the scenario is.
Right.
So being able to acknowledge, like, you've given me feedback, I don't plan on taking it, and I'm happy with my decision. But it's a really nice way to say it, is like, you know, like, I hear you, I hear your suggestion for me, and I'm choosing to do my own path.
Perfect. And I also feel like the whole boundaries thing. I mean, there's not a lot of those, and I don't know why. And it's funny because people that do have very strong boundaries, the first impression that you might hear from somebody who experiences trying to have crossed that boundary is, wow, is she ever a or or is he ever an and it's not a bad thing to say, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to do it that way. This is the way I choose to do it. And you're right, it's all about tactful communication that gets the point across. But I don't know why everybody feels like they have to walk around, engaging with other people when they don't want to engage with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, and I also like to point out that boundary setting doesn't always have to be like when it's crossed, that we can set boundaries by acknowledging what we really appreciate as well. So,
Awesome.
you know what I mean? So like, to kind of teach people how we want to be treated. So if, I don't know, I'm saying, instead of swooping in, someone gives you time to try to figure out the scenario first. Or I love it when people like ask first, like, do you want some feedback about, like, you know, what's happening here? And most of the time I'm like, yes, please, please help me. But I love that I'm being asked to say, hey, do you want to like hear something that I'm noticing? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Right. And then it already is like an invitation. So then if I hear that, I might say like, I really appreciated that. Like, thank you for asking first.
Wow.
And then that's teaching somebody a boundary, which is, I like that you asked and then offered help.
That is pretty cool. And it's putting a positive reinforcing type of experience on it for yourself. It gives you a voice. It gives you a voice. You know, you can ask someone if they want to hear it, but for the person that's listening to that question, they're like, oh, you're giving them an opportunity to say, no, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Keep it simple.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we can touch on this topic again in the spring, but
yes. Oh yeah. Like I said, all of these could be their own episode.
Exactly. All right. So to close, and I don't know, the way I've asked this question is I think kind of small in the way though that we could get into it. So because we had talked about, was it two imperfect partners, you know, like you know, you have human and horse, and how do you bring them together? So what would you say the best way to maintain perspective for a relationship is between two imperfect partners?
Right. And I love that, because it's this idea around, it's like almost like that we're trying to pursue some element of perfection we have in our heads with two imperfect partners. So I think sometimes just keeping that in mind in and of itself can keep you focused on that. Right. And I honestly think the relationship is the backbone to everything that we're doing, because there's so much communication happening that's instinctual and nonverbal and based on this relationship that we have. And I almost feel like I think something and my horse will respond to it. And that is really cool. The more you think about it, the cooler it gets, at least for me. Right. And I can be a big nerd about this stuff, but I will think something and then sometimes she'll just do it. And I'm just like, oh my God. So that's the thing, is just like a really cool thing to just like be that like 12-year-old version of yourself again, and just think that's really cool, and like not lose sight of that, even if you've been riding for 50 years or however long. Right. I love the show Yellowstone. It's one of my favorites. And so I'm going to steal a quote from them. So there was a quote that I saw that was about something along the lines about, it's about cowboying and how it's about you and a horse doing a job, trying like heck not to let the other down.
Aww.
And I just was like, oh, that's perfect. So I thought that was perfect for what we were going to talk about, because I love that as a lens. My only job is to work as hard as I can to not let her down. And then she's already going to work as hard as she can to not let me down. And it really focuses us on being like a partnership and a team together to kind of achieve something.
And it sounds so simple, but I think we overdo it. I think the human element overthinks things, and that's where those tigers that aren't in the room start showing
Yes.
up in the head, and then the horse
Yeah.
is like, "There's a tiger? Where's the tiger?"
Yes. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
100%, right? And so if we're focused on, like there's a reality of, say, the intenseness of being at a show, for example, or training for a show. But if in that moment we're in our home arena, just working really hard to come together and do a job and not let each other down, but our head as the human is in, summer show season, then it's just, we're not going to be vibing. And so I feel like when you're saying, how do we not lose that relationship, is about remembering, okay, like in this moment, this is what we're doing. It's okay to have goals to prepare for, but in each moment, this is where we're at and this is what we're doing. Because that is the one thing I think that makes horses so therapeutic, is that they are always living in the moment.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that we can learn from that, and that they're not thinking about show season 2022, right?
No.
They're thinking of that moment and what's happening and responding to this exact moment. And like, we could learn a lot from taking a page out of their book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just be in the moment. I know when I was teaching in the equine massage therapy program, and often the beloved oral practical exam. So students would come in, it would take about a half an hour. These things were dreaded by many. And, a lot of what I was trying to do for the students to prepare them for that is, dealing with these anxious moments and trying to, get them like, look, just throw the gloves off. Let's just step into it with confidence and doing all this kind of stuff. And I remember one time I was in the barn with one student, and the horse was so chill, just totally zoned right out. And she had a wonderful oral practical exam. It was brilliant. She left. I have about 5-10 minutes. It's just me and the horse. And God bless her soul, the next student walked in. She was probably 20 feet away from the horse. The horse woke up from a dead sleep, head straight up, eyes wide open. And as soon as this student was in her space, the horse was just like, I want nothing to do with you. It was crazy. And I had to take a bit of a teaching moment outside of the OP. And I'm like, look, so-and-so, I still remember her name. Just be aware. Like, this is a perfect example of how you don't even know what you're bringing towards this situation with your horse, or with the test horse even, right? So, I think I've always tried to encourage my clients, like massage clients, as you're approaching your horse, like just to kind of think of it as a, in the moment kind of thing. Like at the end of a long day, you're rushing in the barn, you've got to get home and make dinner and blah, blah, blah. And the horse is like, wait a minute, I've just seen you. Don't yank me out of the stall and everything else. And absolutely, as a massage therapist, I am 100% aware of where my head is at before I put my hands on a horse. And if I'm not in the right space, I will take 10-15 minutes. I will go sit out in the car. And I mean, that's never happened in years. But when I first started practicing, I had to, because I was a bit more nervous and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they're like little mirrors, right? Well, big mirrors, I guess.
Big mirror.
Yes. Right. Like flashing back to you what's happening for you. Right.
Yeah. So that's, and we get the partner that we need, not necessarily the partner that we want.
Such a good point. Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So we have to be open to what they're going to teach us. And a lot of the times the human element thinks, oh, I know this is what we are going to do. And the horse is like,
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Right. And then, so yeah, like I said, could be a whole other episode, but I feel like, yes, it shows you sort of like the places where you can grow in lots of different ways. It could be your riding, it could be emotional, it could be lots of things, but they'll echo that back to you. So going back to that relationship idea, I feel like even in the moments where you're trying something and the horse is going, that there's a learning moment in there. Right. And like, that's actually like, again, the same thing of that magical moment where I thought something and she did it. It's more frustrating, but it's also pretty magical if you think about it, that if I'm not thinking or doing something that is necessary ingredient, that she won't do it, that it's equally learning, if that makes sense. And it's equally like, that is part of the partnership. Like, that's where I need to pick her up, if that makes sense. And there's
Yeah.
times where she's going to pick me up. So the whole idea of that is this idea around, we don't lose sight of that for like, you know, I need to get X number of strides here, and that's the only thing I'm thinking about, that we lose sight of this is the core of it, this relationship.
Always
Yeah.
remember the core of it.
Yeah.
So for those people then that have those anxious moments, what would you like, again, sort of going back and touching on that aspect, because it is about the self-awareness. So now that we've shared with this whole two imperfect partners, really, you're not expected to be perfect. So if you're having these moments, just take yourself out of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And be aware of your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Like, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, right? And that's the idea of remembering that it's a partnership. So it is about us not letting the horses down, but also that we have a partner in our horse. And so we also don't kind of have to be perfect, and that, you know, nothing is more, you know, fueling for the soul than like what those forgiving, honest horses who do their own trying like heck, in that analogy, right? Where, you know, you're like, oh, I asked for a bad distance there, or I cued that improperly, and they just like gave you gold anyways. Right? And you're just like, oh, bless your soul.
Yeah.
So like, and that's part of it, right? That it doesn't matter, you don't have to be perfect all the time, and they're not going to be perfect all the time, but together that we can like fill in some of those gaps for each other. Right? Yeah.
Well, then, Kendra, what kind of advice then over these next few months do you think you can, what can we, you know, depart people with in this episode, whether they can maybe work on before we talk to them again in the spring?
I feel like maybe it would be like, if I could think of like an overarching piece of the things we talked about today, would be again that thing of like not losing sight of those like bigger picture, the meaningful parts of why we're doing what we're doing, and then using that as how you're going to set those realistic goals, if that makes sense. So not setting a goal that's going to be way too much to work for, but also something that's like allows you to have that space to have the relationship with the horse, enjoy your riding just as much as you're challenging yourself. So again, kind of always remembering the like, why are we doing this? Because I think that's a really funny question that a lot of equestrians ask, like, why do we do this? Right? Because in a lot of ways it's pretty crazy, but it's, I don't know, for me myself, it's pretty crazy because of how amazing it is, and that it's such a like intangible feeling that if we don't leave space for that in our training or at shows, then why are we doing this? Because otherwise, then it's just a bunch of stress. So those like intangible, like that feeling of just like those cool little magic moments, right? It's almost like what, I know there's another phrase that's something that's like, not all the moments are going to be magical, but there's magic in every moment. And I think that idea is something that could be helpful too, of that. So it's not like every ride is going to be perfect, but there's going to be these moments that if you pay attention, that there's always going to be those moments, whether it be on the ground or under saddle, you just have these like moments. That
and even when they're not in the barn, you know, when I don't know, during their average day, I think going back to that self-awareness, self-evaluation, all of that kind of stuff. Because I mean, when you want to succeed in something, it takes practice. So, you know, saving all of this for when you're just at the barn, just with your horse, you know, it otherwise, like, that doesn't make sense, right? So I think it's something they would want to include to help them get there.
And it's a really good point, because all the things that we've talked about today apply across the board. Should you choose to, you could apply it across the board in your entire life, and it will benefit your riding.
Yes.
Right. In that, like, so if you're setting boundaries in your life, and if you learn how to be more assertive, that same thing, you'll have that grit when you're doing something at the barn. And that's not just about only at the barn using those skills, that they can be helpful across the board. Right.
I think so. I think
absolutely.
That's a very good place to end this conversation. I think that was well put. I think we've wrapped this up well. Thank you so much, Kendra, for doing this. I really appreciate your input, and I'm very happy to have met you. So this was this was a good
meant to be.
Yes, a good conversation in the making. All right. So where can people get a hold of you? if they're interested in your services?
Yeah. So overall, depending on where people live, I always recommend, if you're looking for therapy, for example, to connect to Psychology Today. So it's a website that's all across, I believe, all of Canada, but definitely Ontario. And you can just type in your region, your location, and there'll be a list of therapists and photos and descriptions of their work and that sort of thing and what they specialize in. So I'm on there as well. So that's the easiest way, but you can also connect to whoever you'd like. So I would probably say that would be the best place. So Psychology Today, if you just Google it, it'll pop up, put in your city, and you'll find a therapist in your city, and you'll see who you want. And if you happen to be in London, you can look me up.
Now, do you have a website, don't you?
Yeah, so it's www.devoscounseling.com.
Okay, we will put that in the show notes so people can reach out.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, thank you, Kendra. I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.